Good afternoon, brothers and sisters. Donald Philip Veach from Jacksonville, North Carolina. Let's start with the Trinity Sunday Collect. Almighty and everlasting God, who's given grace to your servants, that we, by our confession of the true faith given to us in your word, that we might acknowledge, know, and affirm the glory of the eternal Trinity, and to worship the unity of three persons, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. We beseech you that you would keep us steadfast in this faith, and evermore defend us from all adversities, who livest and reignest one God, world without end. Well, we're into chapter 3, following Professor Jasper Ridley's exposition on Thomas Cranmer's life. This is his second ambassadorial tour in the service of Henry VIII. Titled Ambassador at Ratisbon. So let's just pause for a minute and ask where that is and what might we learn about Ratisbon. It's actually the Old English name for Regensburg, Germany. Regensburg, Germany. In southeast Germany, in Bavaria. Let's talk about that. That's where Cranmer will be the official diplomatic envoy to the Roman Emperor, Holy Roman Emperor, which was neither holy nor Roman, it was Germanic. That's where he held diets. We'll talk about a few things. Again, it's in the southeast of Germany, at the confluence where three rivers come together, the northernmost part of the Danube River, and then the Naab River and the Regen River. It has a city of about 150,000. It's not large. It's about the size of my own city here. It's in the state of Bavaria, and it's the fourth largest city after Munich, Nuremberg, and Augsburg. Those are also important cities. Cranmer will get to Nuremberg, and we'll see if he goes to Augsburg, but he's following Charles V, the Roman Emperor. The earliest history goes back to the Stone Age, allegedly, and the Celtic name was Ratisbon. Around 90 AD, and they have remains of that. 90 AD, the Romans built a fort there. 179, it was called Castra Regina, fortress by the river Regen. During the rule of Emperor Marcus Aurelius, which was one of the imperial persecutions of Christians down in the lower sections of his empire. There's an important military camp there right on the Danube River. Also, a Roman bishop had a seat there, and St. Boniface established the bishopric of Regensburg or Ratisbon in 739. From 530 AD to the 13th century, it was the capital of Bavaria. Regensburg remained an important city of Charlemagne. 800 AD, remember Charlemagne traveled around, brought learning and education into the Roman Empire, and was a very devout churchman, attended all services, and rigorously insisted that the monks sing the music with precision. And he himself was a bit of a singer and a bit of a lay scholar. He brought Alcuin from England over as his leading scholar. We're going to skip some of the stuff here. By 800 AD, in the time of Charlemagne, there were 23,000 inhabitants. It's not very big. 1096, the first crusade of Peter the Hermit, he led marauding crusaders that attempted to convert Jews, and anybody who resisted was killed in the name of Christ. There's a stone bridge that's still there today. It was built between 1135 and 1146, of course, with subsequent repairs now and then. But Regensburg was a commercial hub between Northern Europe and Venice. A lot of trade in and out, and that would facilitate the rise of wealthy trading families. there. Holds a there would hold the Holy Roman Empire would hold a diet or a meeting there every 10 years since 1486. There was a famous Diet of Ratisbon in 1541, in which the city elected to embrace the Protestant Reformation, and it became a Lutheran city. But it still remained the permanent city, a permanent site for the Imperial Diet of the Holy Roman Empire until 1806. There was a minority population of Romanists, but the majority, imperial rulers of the city, embraced Lutheranism. We can skip a lot. There was, in World War II, a Messerschmitt aircraft factory there and an oil refinery that the Allies bombed to smithereens in August 17, 1943. As to geography, we've mentioned the significance of this being the northernmost part of the Danube River that flows south. And that will be of interest to our story here with Dr. Cranmer, because Charles V is going to be busy dealing with the Muslim invasions from the south, taking his mind off his Lutheran problem north of him, which gave breathing room for the German Lutheran Reformation to spread. The city itself has the ancient cathedral. It was begun in 1275, completed in 1634. It's a Lutheran cathedral now. Two towers, twin towers, were added in 1869. St. Peter's Church. It's got a lot of monuments. It's got a couple of cloister abbeys, much like English cathedrals have. We mentioned the stone bridge built in 1135. And Crusaders in the Second and Third Crusades used that bridge to cross the Danube from the north as they were headed to the east. There's also the remains of a Roman fortress at Porta Praetoria. There's also another 12th century parish, Church of St. James. Another old parish church of St. Ulrich of the 13th century, with a valuable antiquarian collection there. As we noted, it became the site for wealthy patrician families who would compete with one another for this, that, and the other, as wealthy people often do, in greed, envy, position, place, status, affirmation, and attaboys. Charles V stayed at the Golden Cross Inn. Charles V is of interest in our story on Cranmer. It's got a library, university, a seminary for Episcopalians, school of church music, an abbey, museums, theaters, music, and more. So that gives a sense of Regensburg or Ratisbon. I think we prayed, did we not? I trust we did. Yes. Now, Cranmer has returned to England, and we don't get a lot of details on him for several months, except that he's staying most likely at the Durham house with the Wiltshire family. And the Henrician matter of the divorce is still ongoing, and Henry's trying to get this thing fixed. Cranmer is clearly working for Henry. Let's pick up there. So off Tom goes in 1532. He becomes a resident at the ambassador's court at Ratisbon. He gets there on the 14th of March after leaving in January 1532, which gives you some sense of the time and travel of him and his retinue. Cranmer saw very little of the emperor while he was at Ratisbon, or Regensburg, that we just talked about, for Charles was suffering from gout and spent most of his time in the neighboring health resort of Aubach, But he carried on negotiations with Charles's chief minister, Nicholas de Perronneau de Granville. The great danger was the Turkish danger down to the south. News had reached the west in the autumn of 1531 that Soleiman, the Turk, the Muslim, was preparing another invasion of Austria. And they do get up to Austria at one point, but are repelled, thankfully. Otherwise, Europe would be a stronghold of Islamic theocracy. We'd all be forced into Islam. And I've been to the Middle East, brothers and sisters, and I saw one of the portcullis in, on a blank here, western side of the Red Sea, where a man was beaten 39 lashes. Or Iran, those little fellas running out of us with their little puny gunboats. It's a theocracy. They don't have freedom of religion like we have. It's hard for Americans to really digest that. But we have to factor that into our studies. So Charles V is about positioning and going south to meet the danger. Meanwhile, the English and German, French, Swiss Reformations are going on. Every Englishman had been taught to be conscious of the Turkish menace, as they knew of the Crusades, Richard the Lionhearted and others, and knew that in theory the whole of Christendom ought in theory and practice to assist the emperor, its titular temporal head, to repel the Muslim invaders. But King Henry was not at all anxious to incur the trouble and the expense in order to help Charles, who was a chief obstacle in his way to the divorce. Charles I was the nephew of Catherine of Aragon, the wife of Henry. And Pope Clement was bowing over backwards not to offend Emperor Charles again, because Charles had been in Rome, sacked it, said some pretty nasty things about the Pope. He's greedy, money hungry. He had Pope Clement's number and the popes preceding him, living in Renaissance majesty and glory and other things. When Charles sent an envoy to England to make a formal appeal for military and financial assistance against the Turks, Henry made vague promises of support, but said that his definite answer would be communicated to Cranmer in due course. Cranmer's duty at Ratisbon, and I will substitute Regensburg, the modern term, was to play for time. Now, this is kind of helpful for a pause here. You'll recall that one biographer said Cranmer was as artless as a child. And in previous years, I was kind of wondering, what are we to make of this? That's fake. That's not reading the history right. We read while on his first ambassadorial trip, he knew that money was changing hands for favorable opinions from the universities in Henry's behalf. So Cranmer knows how to bob and weave, dodge, tap dance, play diplomatic games, speak in euphemisms. And does that make him crafty and cunning? We do church, again, our holistic approach in studies is never forget the Old Testament. Remember, Cranmer's a Bible man, New Testament. Never forget systematic theology as we do church history, which we're doing here. We're doing one slice of church history. This morning we were doing a broader look at church history in the early apostolic period. And we don't forget practical theology. And cultural issues, arts, entertainment, politics, society, books, And that's a big agenda that we bring. It's a weighty hermeneutic, but that's what we try to do. So I've got to modify my own view of Cranmer here, that he knew how to play diplomatic games, and he was not alone. It wasn't just him. It was the English court playing to buy time, and Cranmer's a part of that. For he was to give Charles all moral support against the Turks, but to promise nothing more. He was instructed, that would have been by writing, and have telephones and computers and internet. They had diplomatic correspondence going back and forth traveling. And often those diplomatic correspondences are very telling. And I haven't had the privilege to get into the diplomatic correspondence that is in the actual libraries, like at the Vatican and in London. But for example, the Vatican holds all kinds of diplomatic correspondence with Henry VIII. I'd love to get in there and see that stuff. I think men like Dr. Ashley Null and Dr. Gerald Bray have done some, and Dr. Torrance Kirby have done some of that work. But you get a lot of insight in diplomatic correspondence going back and forth. So Cranmer's under instruction in his service, instructed to negotiate a new trade deal with Charles in order to extend the opportunities for the merchants' trade with Flanders. But he was unable to make much progress there, as the emperor left the government of Flanders to his sister Mary of Hungary in Brussels. We'll say this, that 99.5% of England didn't know what was going on. Remember being in Exeter, England, a couple hundred miles from London, and meeting a cashier and talking with her. She said, "I've never been to London." Kind of surprised me. But so she hadn't visited this, that, and the other. Maybe saw stuff on TV or learned things in English schools. But she got Sharon and I hooked up with a taxi service to go back to the University of Exeter where we were staying. So back then, again, 9.5% people, they don't know what Henry and Cranmer are doing. Cranmer made secret contacts with the Lutherans. This is very significant. We're 1532 now. We know he's been watching this stuff for at least 11 years, back to 1521. We know he's aware of Lutheran writings and Henry's position on the Luther question. We know some of the anti-Lutheran bishops, Stokesley, Bonner, Gardner for sure, Sir Thomas More, Archbishop William Warham in the early game before his death in 1532, Cardinal Wolsey. We say John Fisher? Yeah, we did. The Lutherans were engaged in protracted negotiations with Charles. Now, this is 1532. We got to keep in mind the Diet of Augsburg, 1530, where there was some kind of peaceful détente, I guess we could call it, between the German and Protestant or the Lutheran princes. So there was diplomatic stuff going on. We see the effects of that with the Augsburg Confession penned by Philip Melanchthon, with Luther lurking in the background. He's a public target, public enemy number one to the Pope and Emperor V. He's got a hit job put out on Martin Luther. And that's why I think he's got PTSD. He complained of having Anfechtung, depressive episodes. He complained frequently of that. Yeah, he was under siege. Not just from human rulers, but from the devil. and his crew. To quote Calvin, the devil and his crew. The Lutherans were engaged in these protracted negotiations with the Roman Catholic Charles, who was prepared to compromise on religious controversies in order to obtain military assistance from the Lutherans against the Turks. Negotiations did not make much progress at first, and in May, Cranmer seems to have thought that the Diet at Nuremberg, again, that's in the southern part of Germany and Bavaria. Maybe next time we'll try to give a survey like we did of Regensburg here. He thought that the Diet at Nuremberg would break up without any agreement being reached. But on 18 May, he wrote to the government and apparently told them that the emperor was ill and that the Diet of Nuremberg had broken up in disorder, and that the Lutherans had made an alliance with King Sigismund of Poland, King Frederick of Denmark, that are going Lutheran, John Zapolya of Hungary, Albert of Brandenburg, the Grand Master of East Prussia, against Charles and his brother Ferdinand of Austria. And it has down in the footnotes here some references to the diplomatic cables or diplomatic documents, which again, I say, are always very insightful, especially the Spanish ambassador or the Imperial ambassador to England, Ch.3. He's alert. He's got his ear to the ground, and what's the latest gossip news, prognostications. He's always reporting back. And the historians have sifted through some of that with some insightful things of honest talk, stripping off the diplomatic smiles and the fake face. This information by Cranmer, however, was incorrect, and it's perfectly possible that Cranmer never gave it. For we know about the contents of the letter only through a conversation between Ch.3, Eustace Ch.3, I just mentioned him, Charles's ambassador in London, with the Duke of Norfolk. So it's a second-hand story, who was now Henry's chief advisor. Ch.3 said that Charles should soon have the Lutherans under control. The Duke of Norfolk told him what Cranmer had written in his letter. At this point, I don't see any reason to doubt Cranmer or even Norfolk's report, but maybe I'm missing something. He later told him that he could not do so, as he had left the matter with the king. This may have been because he'd given Ch.3 a misleading account. Ch.3 writes to Charles V on 28 June 1532 in the Spanish calendar. And then there's some correspondence to Frederick of Saxony, Luther's patron, and others in the LP papers of 1538. Cranmer was not entitled to play any part in the Diet at Ratisbon and Nuremberg. I think we will do that next time. We talked about Regensburg and Nuremberg, the scene of the trial of the German Nazi officers after World War II. But he went to Nuremberg, and that foregone. He was at Ratisbon, Regensburg, and so I think it's a reasonable inference that Cranmer attended divine services in St. Peter's of Regensburg and saw the sights of the old city. But when he's there in 1532, it's still a Roman Catholic city. It's not till 42, we said, where the city decides to embrace the Reformation of the Lutheran version. But he's also in Nuremberg, 1532. And on at least two occasions spoke with Lutheran leaders. On the 14th of July, he went there secretly and met John Frederick of Saxony and Spalatin, a friend of Martin Luther's and a lawyer, and Pautanus, his advisors. Cranmer returned to Regensburg the next day. So we're talking here about 14 July. I want to just mark that, 1532. Once again, we're going to be asking the governing questions. What does Cranmer know? What does he read? When does he know this and that? What does he believe in 1532, July 14? We know he's been in the books. We know he's had exposure to Tyndale's work. We know he knows of the Lutheranizing movement. Not all of Lutheranism, but certain aspects of it, including justification by faith alone and other matters that are expressed in the 1536 articles that are reversed by the 1539 articles, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. So we have long asked this question, and we're asking it again. What does Cranmer know? When does he know it? What's he reading? Does he have any books with him? We've made the point repeatedly. It was a real demotion, reduction. He got more money for what he's doing. It was a preferment in that sense, and he's associated with the diplomatic court of Henry and Henry himself, but he was at Cambridge as a quiet academic don, reading and praying. It's a better position than serving Henry's court. He was serving in God's court. He was training young men for ministry. It's a far higher calling, in my estimation, as a minister of the gospel, to seek the obedience to the faith of Jesus Christ. But as we've noted, Cranmer had little choice when Henry said, I need you. It was Erastian Tudor England, and you did not say no to a king. But I digress. So he's taken this secret trip. Oh boy. Why is it secret? Is he naive and artless as a child, as the biographer said, or is he careful? He's careful and cautious, we grant that. Cunning? We'll have to evaluate that question as we go. He returned to Regensburg the next day, but went back to Nuremberg on the 20th of July. Again, traveling unobtrusively with only one servant attending him, and he had a further talk with Spalatin. Well, now, what is Spalatin going to tell him about Lutheranism and Martin Luther at Wittenberg, and of the German peasant revolt of 1525, something Cranmer would always have in the background of his mind against the excesses of the Anabaptists. And he'd have to face that later in his life with the Devonshire Uprising of 1549. And here we've got this private meeting with Spalatin, the Lutheran. Oh boy, I wish I could have been a fly on that wall. You think Cranmer's asking questions, theological questions? He's talking to a lawyer now, but lawyers are always fun to talk to. They like talking. I enjoy my lawyer friends. I've got a couple judges in church. You ask them a question, get prepared for a long answer. Great people. A lot of lawyers in the church, too. What are you going to do? You teach theology, of course. Spalatin and Cranmer. What's the date on that? That's worth mentioning. For our Cranmer readers, that's 20 July 1532. We're talking about Cranmer's theological developments and his own commitments and convictions. He embraces some of Luther's stuff, but he rejects other stuff too, particularly Luther's. What's the word I want? His vigor. Polite way to put it. Luther's fun to read. He's easy to read. He's funny because he's always on the attack against the Pope. He hates the Pope. Every 4 or 5 pages, you can expect a tirade and an outburst as him and Philip Melanchthon are drinking beer. And Luther's bragging, I didn't do anything, he says. All I did was preach the word. And him and Philip Melanchthon would have a beer drinking contest of who could say the Lord's Prayer before the other one got done drinking the stein of beer. Spalatin and Cranmer, 20 July, 1532. Well, I think we're going to stop there, but there's a lot of reasons here to think that Cranmer is quasi-semi-Lutheran at this point. We'll take it up tomorrow, God willing. Let's close with prayer. May all of the glory and the honor be to you, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, now and evermore, world without end. Amen. Godspeed.